All right, I want to start off by talking about the Swiss public transport system. So a lot of you probably arrived here in one of these, and chances are your experience was quite nice, quite pleasant. This is because we're internationally renowned for having a pretty well set up public transportation system. It's clean, it's punctual, it's modern, but that's not it. Thanks to wide doors, accessible bathrooms, and ramps at every station, it just happens to be extremely accessible as well. What this means is that anyone can go anywhere in Switzerland, no matter their physical abilities. And this is not just a coincidence, it's actually written into law in Switzerland. But we don't make trains at Ginetta, or trams, unfortunately, would be cool, but we make digital products. So how does it look like in the digital world? So let's start with the good news. We've actually made quite a bit of progress in the past couple of years with innovations in assistive technology, like screen readers or alternative themes. But accessibility is in no way guaranteed on the web, like it is in Swiss public transport system. And this is due to a million of reasons, but I just want to highlight 3 of them really quick. So first of all, there's a lack of legal pressure. So accessibility is really not enforced legally in any way in Switzerland, with the exception of federal sites. So this is not necessarily just bad, but it obviously contributes to a lesser sense of urgency for companies to make their products and websites accessible. Secondly, also a huge thing, a lack of visibility. So what I mean by this is that the measures that we have to take to make websites accessible are far less obvious than their physical world counterparts, like ramps or wide doors, super obvious. In addition to this, all of us have observed someone in the physical world struggling with the physical world in public, in anywhere really. What we don't see is this same person going home, sitting on their computer and struggling with the internet or their phone or whatever. So there's a lack of empathy there as well. And finally, this is sort of the biggest thing, there's just like a general lack of awareness around this topic. So people don't really talk about it that much. There's like a lot of misconceptions. It's super hard, or there's no point even, and people convince themselves that they're not qualified to speak up, and it just sort of falls to the wayside, and it gets silently deprioritized to an extent. And I have to admit, this applied to me as well only a couple of months ago. So I was confused and intimidated by accessibility, and now looking back, I sort of have to cringe a little bit, because the work that I did was, on the surface it was great, and I got pats on the back for it and stuff, but it excluded people, not because I did some deliberate scoping or it was super hard or something, but just because I was clueless, pretty much. So, obviously, at this point, now diving into the topic a bit, I care quite a bit about this, but why should you? What are the ramps for the web, and who's responsible for building them? So, I want to start off by quickly explaining what I mean by web accessibility. So, it's actually quite simple. So, web accessibility means that tools, websites, and technologies are developed so people with disabilities can use them. And just to put this into perspective really quickly, this accounts for 1.8 million people in Switzerland, of which 29% can be considered severely disabled. But here's the thing, it's not just these people we're doing this for, in no way. Everyone here has at some point been in a situation where we've been temporarily disabled, either through injury or through simple environmental factors like sunlight reflecting off of your screen on a bright day. But even going beyond disability, this is not just a question of disability. There's actually so much overlap between things that are essential to making products accessible and are at the same time just convenient and make for good UX for regular people, for the average user. So the point is really, you're not just doing this for a small minority group. Investing in accessibility really just makes your product, your website, better and more usable for everyone, for all users. So let's assume at this point I've convinced you. So how do we go about this? What do we do now? And I really want to quickly touch upon how accessibility is measured nowadays. So we have 3 levels, from A to AAA. A meaning, your website or your tool is usable, but the experience sucks. But it's usable, so it's better than nothing. And AAA is the highest possible standard, the gold standard, if you will, but it's super, super tricky to attain. So now when I ask designers, or specifically designers, about what are some measures we can take, I always get these two. So make sure your contrast is sufficient and don't use fonts that are too small, which is great. I mean, by all means do this. It's super important. But, and I'm not proud of myself for this one, it's the iceberg. It's the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more. There's website architecture, navigation, context, semantics. All these things contribute just as much, if not more, to an accessible website. And designers can do something about this. Or not just, it's not just the job of the developers. So yeah, let's look at a couple examples here. First off, when designing a page or a page layout, think about how your content is sequentially consumed. And why is this important? Well, let's take a look at this example here. Pretty cool to look at, right? So me as a sighted user, I can just skim this content, no problem at all. I can look into the thing that I'm interested in, boom, I'm ready to go. Someone who is visually impaired obviously does not have this luxury. So they really depend on a logical, sequential representation of your content. And to get a feeling of how this would be on this site, let's step into a blind person's shoes for a second. So I'm on my computer, tab. Right away, I'm up here. I have to click through, I don't know if you see it very well, but each individual game, and I have to go through all of it to get to the next level. So fuck this, I'm out. I'm throwing in the towel at this point. But if I muster up the courage to continue, then we go here, same thing. I have to go through every single link. Now one more click, and finally the content. But it's not the main content. It's this side thing, and again, same story. We have to go through each individual link. And now, if I've made it this far, I'm at the content. But yeah, people are not going to make it, I think, to this point. So this is obviously an extreme example, but it's good to explain these things. Like it's a good way to explain this principle. So how can we make this better? Now let's look at the New York Times page, for example. Same thing, tab, we end up here. Menu and little search icon. Then it gets interesting. Boom, this little, before invisible thing pops up, which allows us to just bypass the whole navigation. Like, we don't have to go through each point like we did on ESPN.com. We just go straight, with 3 clicks, we go to the main story. And notice how there's no sidebar we have to go through first. It just goes right into the main story. So this really shows as well how if we think about accessibility already in the design phase, in the layout of a page, we're saving the developers a lot of headache and time trying to decipher our shitty layout and make it somehow accessible in retrospect. And the end product, obviously, is much more usable. So let's look at one more measure. Give your pages and your page sections titles. This is super important. Titles give context. And context is essential for you to transmit your message to your users. This is true for abled people, but obviously expounded if you can't see, if you have a disability. And let's go back to our ESPN example for a second. So we've determined it's a pain in the ass to go through this sequentially, impossible. But screen readers have a kind of a trick up their sleeve. So thankfully, this page has some titles here, quick links, ESPN, top headlines, and so on. And what we can now do is pull this into an index, into sort of a backbone of the page, and a user can now jump between these sections, no problem. If you don't have titles or you're missing titles, obviously, you can't do this. So now the burning question, who's responsible for this? And I'm sure you can see it coming. Everyone has to pitch in, yeah. You're not off the hook. No. Everyone can do something. It's not just a task you do at some point in the process. The developers do it at the end, or the designer makes sure it's accessible. It's sort of a fundamental principle, just like good user experience, that we have to hold ourselves accountable to in every project. And yeah, it's just a part of good design. And even if you're not a designer or a developer, if you're more in a planning, say, role, you can still do a lot of things to contribute to a more accessible website or product. So you can assess the risk of not meeting accessibility targets. You can define these targets and empower your team to meet them. And yeah, you can even just open your current website, tab through it, see how it stacks up. Yeah, so let's quickly recap. So accessible design is not, or accessibility is not just for a minority group, for the disabled. It just contributes, it's better design in general and really helps everyone. Then accessibility is much more than just color and type, as I tried to illustrate. And everyone should pitch in, everyone has to pitch in, and everyone can. So there we go, Geneva logo.